Have you ever smiled while an arrogant billionaire threw a filthy rag at your face, ordering you to scrub his $10,000 Italian shoes? I dropped to my knees, willingly, not from fear, but because I needed that ground level angle to photograph the fatal cracks in his $1 billion foundation. He thinks I am just a cleaning rat, unaware this rat holds the legal detonator to turn his entire empire into ash. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. I am 38 years old, and right now, I smell like cheap ammonia and rotting seaweed. I stood at the edge of the Azure Crest megaproject, a colossal seawall and luxury resort development tearing through the natural coastline of Malibu, California. The Pacific breeze whipped around me, carrying the heavy exhaust of diesel excavators and the sharp tang of industrial sealants. I wore a stiff, scratchy blue polyester janitor uniform that clung to my sweating skin. My hands gripped the cracked handle of a rusted cleaning cart. Its wheels shrieked a pathetic rhythm as I pushed it over the uneven concrete. I dragged a heavy mop through a puddle of chemical runoff, blending perfectly into the background. To anyone looking, I was just another nameless laborer at the bottom of the food chain. But beneath this degrading disguise beat the highly trained heart of a federal predator. I am the Senior Inspector Director of the Federal Coastal Infrastructure Oversight Bureau. I had willingly traded my tailored executive suits and my silver badge for a dirty rag because of a single encrypted email warning of catastrophic structural deviations hidden deep within the Azure Crest blueprints. Standard protocol would only result in closed doors and a swarm of corporate lawyers. To find the rot in a billionaire's playground, I had to become the dirt they walked on. Azure Crest was the absolute crown jewel of Julian Vance. Julian was a real estate titan with the sculpted jawline of a magazine model and the moral compass of a starving shark. He was an arrogant monster who calculated human lives as disposable data points on his financial spreadsheets. To Julian, worker casualties and future structural failures were just acceptable margins of error on the path to adding another zero to his bank account. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy steel gates swung open. Julian arrived with the pomp of an emperor. He was leading a flock of local politicians and potential foreign investors on a highly sanitized site tour. They looked utterly ridiculous, wearing pristine white hard hats over custom-tailored Italian suits. Julian walked at the front of the pack, his chest puffed out with blinding arrogance. He gestured grandly toward the massive ocean-facing columns, spinning lies about his unwavering commitment to safety. I kept my head down, pushing my squeaking cart near the edge of the designated walkway. I tried to make myself as small and invisible as possible, but Julian was putting on a theatrical show, and every dictator needs a target to demonstrate his power. His cold eyes scanned the dusty perimeter and locked immediately onto my battered cart. He broke away from his entourage and marched directly into my path. Before I could even register his movement, Julian raised his $10,000 polished leather shoe and kicked my mop bucket with brutal, intentional force. "What is this absolute garbage doing on my main walkway?" Julian barked, his voice echoing off the surrounding concrete walls. Foul. Dark water exploded across the pavement, splashing heavily onto the hem of my pants. I stood perfectly still, clutching the handle of my mop so tightly my knuckles turned white. The entourage of politicians instantly fell silent. None of them dared to speak a single word against the man funding their re-election campaigns. "Look at me when I speak to you." "Trash," Julian snapped. He reached into his designer breast pocket, pulled out a crumpled, torn $20 bill, and threw it directly at my face. It bounced off my cheek and fluttered pathetically into the spilled dirty water. "That is compensation for your miserable existence. Now, there is a smudge of mud on my walkway. Your mop is clearly useless. I want you to get down on your knees and scrape that mud off the concrete with your bare hands. Right now. Do it, or you are fired. And I will personally ensure you never clean another toilet in this entire state." Hot bile rose in the back of my throat. The urge to pull out my federal credentials and arrest him was almost overpowering, but I took an agonizingly deep breath, tasting the toxic dust in the air. I forced myself to swallow the humiliation. I nodded submissively. I dropped to my knees on the hard, unforgiving ground. I pressed my bare fingers into the abrasive mud and began to scrape. Behind me, I heard a few of the politicians chuckle nervously. "See that, gentlemen?" Julian laughed loudly. "Order, unbreakable discipline. You always have to remind the bottom feeders exactly where they belong." He turned his back on me with a dismissive wave, leading his guests away. He truly believed he had crushed my spirit. But as I knelt there in the dirt, my face hovering mere inches from the ground, my eyes locked onto the base of the massive support columns, this was an angle the official building inspectors would never stoop down to examine. From down here in the mud, the devastating truth was glaringly obvious. The high-grade, marine-level waterproofing sealant applied to the foundation was subtly bubbling and peeling away in long strips. I leaned closer. Beneath the flaking exterior, running deep along the primary load-bearing piles, were distinct, jagged microfractures. The concrete was actively separating. The structural integrity of the entire billion-dollar project was fundamentally compromised. Julian Vance was building a towering palace on legs made of crumbling chalk. I kept scraping the concrete, a slow, icy smile spreading across my lips. Julian had meant to humiliate me. Instead, his monumental arrogance had just handed me the ultimate weapon. By treating me like invisible garbage, he placed me in the exact position I needed to silently collect the irrefutable evidence that would send him to federal prison. The death sentence for Azure Crest was written right here in the concrete, and I was the only one reading it. My janitor uniform was the ultimate master key. Official federal inspectors had to file formal requests 3 weeks in advance just to walk the outer perimeter of Azure Crest. They would be guided by corporate handlers and shown exactly what Julian Vance wanted them to see. But I just pushed my squeaky yellow cart past the heavy security checkpoints with my head down, holding a spray bottle of cheap disinfectant. I had unrestricted access to the dark veins of the construction site. From the subterranean water pump stations to the highly restricted pile casting zones, nobody stops a cleaning lady. Nobody looks twice at the woman taking out the trash. Deep in restricted Sector 4, the massive titanium core anti-seismic supports stood like metal giants holding up the lower promenade. On the official blueprints, these columns cost $2,500,000 each. They were the primary selling point for the foreign investment groups, guaranteed by Vance Corporation to withstand a magnitude 9 earthquake. I waited in the shadows until the site foreman went on his afternoon coffee break. I slipped a solid, heavy rubber mallet from the bottom compartment of my cart, hid it behind my sleeve, and stepped up to the closest giant pillar. I swung my arm, striking the supposedly impenetrable solid titanium surface. The sound that bounced back sent a cold, terrifying shock straight down my spine. It did not ring with the dense, heavy vibration of solid metal. It echoed. It was a dull, hollow, sickening thud. I struck it again, swinging much harder. The exact same hollow sound returned. I pulled out my pocket flashlight and ran the beam along the microscopic joint seams. It was an absolute, monumental fraud. These load-bearing pillars were not titanium. They were high-density, 3D-printed synthetic plastic shells, coated with layers of expensive industrial metallic paint to fool the visual inspections. Julian was building a heavy concrete fortress resting entirely on cheap movie props. But fake pillars were just a symptom. I needed to find the terminal disease. My primary target became Marcus. He was the lead geodetic engineer for the entire project. Marcus was a dangerously thin, exhausted man whose hard hat always seemed 2 sizes too big for his trembling head. For 3 solid days, I watched him from behind my mop. He constantly checked his watch, sweat pouring down his pale neck even when the freezing ocean breeze rolled in. Twice, I saw him duck behind the heavy cement mixers to dry swallow prescription anxiety sedatives with visibly shaking hands. the man was a walking heart attack, carrying a dark secret that was actively eating him from the inside out. I made my move on a Tuesday during the noon lunch whistle. Marcus always ate completely alone near the industrial dumpsters, desperate to get away from the loud banter of the steelworkers. I wheeled my cart toward the bins, casually tossing in heavy black bags of trash. I paused, leaning against the rusty metal container, slowly pulling off my thick rubber gloves. "The ground feels wrong down here today. Does it not?" I said quietly, not even looking in his direction. Marcus jumped violently, dropping his half-eaten sandwich into the dirt. He stared at me, his eyes blinking rapidly. "What did you just say?" "I said the vibration is completely off," I continued, seamlessly adopting the rough, tired drawl of a seasoned blue-collar construction veteran. "I have been pushing heavy equipment carts over freshly poured concrete for 20 years. You usually feel the heavy machinery vibrating right through your work boots, but down here by the seawall, the shockwaves do not bounce back up. The dirt feels like heavy jelly. It kind of reminds me of that massive sinkhole job up in Seattle back in 2008. Marcus turned the color of ash. His bloodshot eyes darted around the empty trash yard. He looked exactly like a trapped animal. I knew instantly that I had struck the absolute nerve. "You are just a janitor," he stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "You do not know anything about what you are talking about. The soil density reports are completely solid." "Are they?" I turned to face him fully, instantly dropping the tired laborer act. I stood up straight, my voice becoming sharp, federal, and precise. "Because I saw the deep microfractures on the primary lode, bearing piles in Sector 2. I tapped your precious titanium columns. They are hollow plastic. So, Marcus, you need to tell me right now, what the hell is actually happening under our feet?" He began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as if he were dying. I grabbed him by the shoulders, pushing him back into the shadows between the dumpsters, hiding us from the main construction yard. "Breathe," I commanded firmly. "Tell me the truth before this entire site becomes a mass graveyard." A wet sob tore from his throat. The psychological dam broke. "Liquefaction," he whispered, the word sounding like a literal death sentence. "The geological surveys. They are completely faked. Every single one of them. The bedrock beneath Azure Crest is not stable rock. The underground water pressure is way too high. And the deep soil composition is mostly loose, shifting silt. Because of the heavy vibrations from the drilling, the ground is undergoing active liquefaction." I felt the blood drain completely out of my face. I understood the devastating technical reality of that specific word. The solid earth beneath this multi-billion-dollar resort was basically turning into wet soup under the immense, crushing weight of the concrete structures. "If a major Pacific storm hits the coast," Marcus continued, tears mixing with the thick gray dust on his hollow cheeks, "or even if we get a mild seismic tremor, those fake friction piles will snap immediately. The entire foundation will lose structural integrity all at once. The whole resort, the seawall, every single building will just slide straight down into the ocean. It will collapse like a wet sandcastle. Thousands of innocent people will drown." "Then you have to blow the whistle," I said, my grip tightening aggressively on his safety jacket. "You are the lead engineer on record. Come with me to the Federal Oversight Board today. We can force them to stop the concrete pouring tomorrow morning." Marcus violently shook his head, physically pulling himself out of my grip. I cannot do it. Julian Vance knows I figured it out. He threatened to completely destroy me. But worse, he offered me a sick deal. My little girl. She is in the intensive care unit. She needs a bilateral lung transplant. It costs $1,200,000. I do not have that kind of money. Julian promised to wire the full amount to the surgical team the exact morning after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. If I speak up now, the project stops, the money vanishes, and my daughter dies. He backed away from me, his eyes completely wild with grief and sheer terror, and ran blindly back toward the main executive office building. I stood alone by the smelly dumpsters, the heavy, salty ocean wind howling a warning in my ears. Marcus was compromised, completely neutralized by a monster of a billionaire who successfully weaponized a desperate father's love. I could not rely on him to testify. A verbal confession whispered to a woman holding a dirty mop would never hold up in a federal courtroom against Julian's endless army of corporate lawyers. If I was going to shut down Azure Crest and save those thousands of future victims, I had to bypass the terrified engineer. I had to find the original, unaltered geological reports and the financial purchase orders for the fake plastic pillars. I needed hard, undeniable paper evidence, and I knew exactly whose secure office held the keys to this kingdom of lies. 2 o'clock in the morning, the Pacific fog rolled over the Malibu coast like a heavy, suffocating gray shroud. The daytime roar of the massive excavators had finally died down, replaced only by the eerie, rhythmic hum of the subterranean water pumps fighting to keep the ocean out of the foundation pit. I was working the graveyard shift, pushing my battered yellow cart toward the temporary executive trailers. Security was typically much lighter at this hour, mostly underpaid guards drinking stale coffee and blindly staring at their mobile phones. Julian Vance kept his private office at the very end of the elevated modular compound. It was an isolated fortress, guarded by a dedicated high-definition security camera mounted directly above the heavy metal door. But I did not need advanced federal hacking gear to bypass his optical surveillance. I relied entirely on the oldest trick in the janitorial playbook. I aimed my heavy-duty spray bottle of industrial foaming glass cleaner straight at the dome lens. 2 thick, aggressive squirts covered the glass in an opaque, bubbling white chemical foam. To the lazy security guard staring at the monitor inside the main command center, the screen simply went hazy, perfectly mimicking a heavy burst of coastal fog or a sudden condensation blur. The chemical trick gave me exactly 4 minutes before the thick foam would begin to drip off and reveal the door again. I quickly slipped my specialized lock-picking tools from the hollowed-out handle of my feather duster. It took me a mere 35 seconds to completely defeat the high-grade commercial deadbolt. I slipped quietly inside and locked the door securely behind me. The large office smelled intensely of expensive leather upholstery, single malt whiskey, and an aggressive, heavy cologne. I pulled the heavy blackout blinds tightly shut against the windows before switching on my small tactical pen light. I did not even bother checking his mahogany desk drawers. Arrogant predators like Julian never left their real sins lying around in plain sight. I swept my narrow beam across the walls until my light stopped on a massive, completely out-of-place feng shui painting of a serene mountain landscape. Julian Vance did not care about spiritual harmony or natural energy. I grabbed the heavy wooden frame and pulled it sideways. Behind the canvas sat a custom-built, heavy-gauge steel wall unit. But it was not just a traditional safe. I noticed a thick black power cable running down the drywall and a small cooling vent cut into the side of the steel box. It was an offline, closed network server. This was the true digital vault of the entire Azure Crest project. I plugged a specialized decryption bypass dongle into the exposed diagnostic port at the bottom of the server unit. My pulse hammered violently in my throat as a small green light began to blink in the pitch-black room. It took 2 agonizingly long minutes for the corporate firewall to completely collapse. I firmly inserted my encrypted federal USB drive and began copying the master root directory. The files rapidly scrolling across my small portable digital screen were a goldmine of absolute, unadulterated corruption. I saw the actual hidden purchase orders for the fake plastic pillars. I saw the original, unedited geological surveys screaming in red text about the catastrophic soil liquefaction happening directly beneath the resort. I saw the complex web of offshore shell companies where the embezzled construction funds were currently being funneled. 300 gigabytes of raw, undeniable treason. The digital progress bar finally hit 89% when I heard it. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of gravel outside the trailer. Then came the sharp, electronic beep of the private perimeter gate disengaging. I froze completely. Heavy footsteps were rapidly climbing the aluminum stairs leading directly to this executive trailer. There were 2 distinct sets of leather shoes. One was definitively Julian. The other step was heavier, dragging slightly on the metal grating. I am telling you, we need to push the timeline forward immediately. Julian's voice suddenly pierced through the thin exterior walls, vibrating with an angry, aggressive edge. The heavy lock mechanism on the front door began to clatter. I had less than 5 seconds. I snatched my USB drive out of the server port, shoving the heavy mountain painting violently back into its original position. I threw myself silently across the dark room, opened the narrow wooden door of the utility closet, and squeezed my entire body inside just as the main office door swung open. The closet was suffocatingly small, packed incredibly tight with spare industrial mop heads, heavy plastic gallons of toxic bleach, and strong commercial floor wax. I pulled my knees tightly up against my chest, burying my face deep into the scratchy polyester fabric of my uniform. The harsh, blinding fluorescent lights of the office flicked on, slicing through the wooden slats of the closet door and painting bright stripes across my face. I slowly reached into my breast pocket, carefully retrieved my Federal Issue voice recorder, and pressed the red tactile recording button. "You are sweating over absolutely nothing, Robert," Julian said confidently, the sound of crystal glass clinking indicating he was calmly pouring himself a drink. "Nothing." The second voice belonged to State Senator Robert. I immediately knew his heavily contoured face from the massive campaign billboards lining the highway. He was the corrupt political shield protecting this entire rotten operation. "The State Inspection Board is coming here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. If they bring their own deep seismic sonar equipment, they will see right through those fake structural supports you installed. We will both be spending the next 25 years rotting in a federal penitentiary." "They are not going to scan a damn thing," Julian laughed. A cold, empty, mechanical sound. "I have already arranged a very private breakfast meeting with the head of the inspection committee. I am personally handing him an offshore account routing number with $1,500,000 currently sitting in it. By 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, he will officially stamp the concrete pouring permit, and those fake pillars will be permanently buried under 5,000 tons of wet cement. And you, my nervous friend, will get your promised 12% equity stake the exact moment the foreign investors wire their final $800 million into our holding company." I recorded every single damning word of their massive conspiracy, but as I crouched in the suffocating dark, my lungs burning intensely from the sharp chemical fumes of the open bleach bottles, I felt a terrible, light tickling sensation on my left hand. I slowly shifted my eyes downward without moving my head. In the faint sliver of light bleeding through the door slats, I saw it, a massive, dark brown recluse spider. It had crawled out of a rotting, damp mop head and was now slowly navigating the bare skin of my knuckles. Its venom was highly necrotic. If it sank its fangs into my flesh, my hand would literally begin to rot. But infinitely worse, the sudden agonizing pain would force me to instinctively gasp or scream. The two men standing a mere 5 feet away would hear me instantly, and I would be dead before my body even hit the ocean water outside. The heavy spider stopped its march right over a highly visible blue vein on the back of my hand. I closed my eyes incredibly tightly. I clamped my jaw shut with brutal, unforgiving force. I locked my teeth together until an intense, aching pressure flooded my senses. I used the fierce, straining tension in my face to actively override the sheer, paralyzing terror coursing through my arm. I did not move a single muscle. I held my breath completely. "I need to put these updated financial projections into the physical vault," Julian suddenly stated. His heavy leather shoes thudded aggressively against the hardwood floorboards, walking directly toward my hiding spot. The hidden wall safe was located right next to this utility closet. His large shadow completely blocked the light streaming through the wooden slats. He was mere inches away from me. I could actually hear him breathing through his nose. If he casually opened this closet door to grab a fresh cleaning rag, my life was entirely over. I urgently needed to create a psychological diversion. My right foot was tightly wedged against a heavy round plastic bottle of concentrated industrial degreaser, with microscopic, agonizing precision. I shifted the heel of my work boot, I tipped the plastic bottle sideways. It hit the floorboard with a soft, dull thud and slowly rolled out from underneath the gap at the bottom of the closet door, bumping directly into Julian's polished shoe. Julian jumped back violently, visibly startled by the sudden movement. "Damn it!" he shouted in absolute disgust. "This entire site is infested with filthy, aggressive rats. They are knocking over the damn cleaning supplies now. Remind me to fire the entire extermination crew first thing tomorrow morning." "Forget the rats, Julian," Robert sighed with deep impatience. "Just secure the damn files and let us get out of here. The smell of this place gives me a massive headache." Julian turned the heavy metal dials of his wall safe, locked it firmly, and walked away from the closet. The bright office lights shut off, plunging me back into total darkness. The heavy door clicked shut, followed immediately by the sound of their footsteps fading rapidly down the exterior metal stairs. I stayed completely frozen in that toxic, suffocating dark box for another 20 full minutes. Only when the heavy silence of the night completely returned to the compound did I dare to push the wooden door open. I violently brushed the venomous spider off my hand, spitting a large mouthful of warm blood directly onto the floorboards. I stood up, my legs shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline. Clutching the small USB drive so hard it physically dug into my palm, I had successfully survived the Devil's Den, and I was now holding the absolute catastrophic destruction of Azure Crest right in my hands. I sat in the cramped driver's seat of my unmarked sedan, parked 3 miles away from the coast, the glow of my encrypted laptop illuminating the dark cabin. My eyes darted across the stolen spreadsheets, piecing together the horrifying timeline of Julian Vance. He was not just building a doomed resort, he was executing a massive hit and run. I found a series of urgent internal memos directing the construction crew to accelerate the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony by exactly 1 full month. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. An international investment conglomerate from Dubai was scheduled to officially transfer $800 million into the Azure Crest holding accounts the exact second the final safety permit was signed tomorrow. Julian never intended to open this resort. The offshore flight logs attached to the financial folder showed a private jet fueled and waiting on the runway for tomorrow afternoon. He was going to take the massive payout, declare sudden bankruptcy through his shell companies, and disappear across international borders long before the fragile fake foundation ever collapsed. The ticking clock in my head grew deafening. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. In less than 6 hours, a fleet of heavy industrial mixer trucks would roll through the gates of Azure Crest. They were scheduled to pour thousands of tons of fast curing, marine-grade concrete directly over those hollow plastic pillars. Once that heavy gray sludge hardened, the physical evidence of the structural fraud would be permanently buried forever. No court in the country would authorize tearing up a billion-dollar foundation based solely on a stolen, unverified USB drive. I had to stop that concrete from pouring. My first instinct was protocol. I reached for my encrypted phone to call the director of the Federal Coastal Infrastructure Oversight Bureau, my direct superior. I needed a tactical strike team deployed by dawn, but as I opened the master bribery ledger on my screen to check the local targets, my own blood turned to absolute ice. Right there, on line 42, was the director's name, sitting next to a monthly wire transfer of $50,000. The rot went all the way to the very top of my own agency. I was completely cut off. If I made that phone call, the director would warn Julian, and my body would be found floating in the bay by tomorrow evening. I was entirely alone. I had to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I desperately needed an emergency federal injunction and an immediate arrest warrant, but I had to bypass the entire compromised chain of command. I pulled up a highly secure private contact number I had not used in exactly 5 years. Judge Thomas was a notoriously unbending, aggressively righteous federal magistrate. 5 years ago, during the catastrophic interstate bridge collapse, I dragged him out of his crushed vehicle just seconds before the burning wreckage sank into the river. He owed me his life. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. This better be a matter of life and death, Eva, he rasped. It is thousands of lives, Thomas, I replied, my voice hard and steady. I have undeniable proof of a massive structural fraud and a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, but my own federal agency is compromised. I need a signed, ironclad warrant to arrest Julian Vance and halt all construction at Azure Crest, and I need it authorized before 8 o'clock this morning. I spent the next 20 minutes rapidly detailing the fake titanium cores, the soil liquefaction cover-up, and the impending flight risk. I heard the scratch of a heavy fountain pen on paper through the speaker. The digital warrant is being transmitted to your secure device right now, he said grimly. Do not miss, Eva. If you are wrong, they will bury you under this prison. I did not sleep a single second that night. I drove back to my cheap motel and meticulously prepared my final act. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy gray clouds broke, allowing a pale, sickly sunlight to wash over the California coast. I stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror. I carefully buttoned up my crisp, heavily starched, pristine white federal officer shirt. I clipped my heavy cold silver and gold federal badge directly over my heart, ensuring it sat perfectly straight. I strapped my tactical utility belt around my waist. I looked exactly like the senior federal authority I truly was. Then, with deliberate, practiced movements, I pulled the oversized, filthy, chemical-stained blue polyester janitor uniform right over my official attire. I zipped it up tightly to my neck, hiding every single trace of the law underneath a thick layer of blue-collar dirt. I shoved my hair under the sweaty, battered cap. The trap was fully set. I grabbed my rusted cleaning cart and walked out into the morning air. It was time to go clean up the garbage. 9 o'clock in the morning, the construction site was completely transformed into an absurd, sickening display of extreme wealth. The heavy rusting machinery and massive dirt trenches were hidden behind flowing white silk curtains that stretched for hundreds of yards along the coastline. 4 sleek, black private helicopters chopped through the heavy coastal winds, landing gracefully on the newly paved upper helipads to deliver the international investment delegation from Dubai. Private security contractors wearing tailored black suits and carrying concealed weapons formed a completely impenetrable human wall around the entire perimeter. Waiters in crisp, spotless tuxedos carried heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported vintage champagne and rare caviar. The salty ocean air literally smelled of old money, expensive floral arrangements, and the faint, undeniable underlying stench of raw sewage and desperate lies. It was a beautiful, glamorous masquerade. A lavish feast arranged exclusively for men who were about to blindly purchase a massive sinking tomb. A gigantic outdoor wooden pavilion had been erected right over the main courtyard, featuring a massive, high-definition digital display screen serving as the impressive backdrop. Julian Vance took the center stage to the sound of thunderous, enthusiastic applause. He looked exactly like a modern, untouchable king. He wore a custom-tailored, midnight blue Italian suit that easily cost more than an average working family earned in 3 entire years. His perfectly white teeth flashed in the bright, blinding stage lights, his unnatural charisma practically oozing from his pores. "Welcome, my esteemed partners and honored guests," Julian announced, his deep, commanding voice carrying perfectly over the premium concert-grade sound system. "What you are standing on today is not just mere concrete and steel, it is a timeless engineering marvel. Azure Crest represents the absolute pinnacle of human ingenuity, luxury, and most importantly, unwavering structural resilience. We have achieved a standard of absolute safety that goes far beyond any ridiculous federal requirement. When the violent Pacific Ocean pushes against our massive walls, we do not bend, we do not break. We stand eternal, guaranteeing your monumental financial returns for generations to come." I listened to his nauseating, arrogant speech from the dark shadows near the back catering tents. I slowly pushed a heavy brass utility cart loaded with silver ice buckets and fresh champagne bottles. I deliberately kept my head bowed, perfectly playing the pathetic part of the invisible, mindless servant. My primary target was not the bright stage just yet. I was aiming for the heavily guarded central control room located inside a modified steel shipping container, situated just behind the massive electronic screen. There was a single, heavily armed security contractor blocking the narrow metal stairs leading directly up to the control booth. He was massive, a terrifying mountain of muscle wearing dark aviator sunglasses and a curled clear earpiece. I pushed my squeaking cart directly toward his position. "Hey, trash collection is in the back alley," the guard grunted aggressively, stepping forward to entirely block my path. "The event coordinators asked for more ice up in the control room," I mumbled softly, keeping my eyes glued strictly to the dirty toes of his tactical boots. "Nobody asked for a damn thing," he growled in a low, threatening tone, reaching out his thick, heavy hand to violently shove my shoulder away. That was his absolute, final mistake, the exact moment his heavy fingers grazed the fabric of my cheap polyester jacket. I dropped the brass cart handle. I stepped smoothly and aggressively into his personal guard, grabbed his thick, hairy wrist with both of my hands, pivoted my hips with violent force, and applied a brutal, perfectly executed joint lock. I twisted his thick arm sharply upward behind his broad back, while simultaneously driving my right elbow directly into the vulnerable side of his thick neck. The massive man collapsed instantly, falling heavy and fast, without making a single sound, his brain completely short-circuited by the precise, devastating strike to his carotid artery. I caught his heavy body just before his skull hit the metal grating, silently dragging his dead weight underneath the dark, concealed stairs. I rushed up the metal steps and slipped quickly into the empty, air-conditioned control room. The audiovisual technician had apparently stepped out for an unauthorized smoke break. A massive, complex mixing console dominated the tiny space, actively controlling the giant screens illuminating the stage outside. I quickly pulled my encrypted digital override device from my deep pocket. It was roughly the size of a standard deck of playing cards. I slammed the heavy connecting cable directly into the main projection system override port. A solid green light flashed brightly on my device. I now possessed total, undeniable control over the massive screens displaying Julian's fake digital renderings. All it would take to end his life was one simple push of a button on my remote wireless detonator. I stepped back out of the control room and positioned myself closely near the side edge of the grand stage, hiding my body behind a massive, towering floral arrangement. I desperately needed to see his arrogant face the exact moment I burned his fraudulent empire completely to the ground. Julian was gracefully wrapping up his grand, deceitful monologue. The wealthy investors were clapping enthusiastically, completely captivated by his magnetic, expensive lies. "Let us raise a glass to the golden future of luxury," Julian shouted triumphantly, holding up his completely empty crystal glass toward the sky. He looked over his left shoulder toward the catering wing, a sudden, brief flash of intense annoyance crossing his perfectly sculpted face. "Where in the hell is the service, you there?" Julian extended his arm and pointed his finger directly into the dark shadows off stage. He pointed straight at my dirty blue uniform. "Yes, you, the filthy cleaner," Julian commanded impatiently over the booming microphone, his loud voice dripping with absolute sickening condescension. "Put down your disgusting mop and bring a fresh, cold bottle of champagne up here immediately. Do not keep our esteemed international guests waiting a single second longer." The entire massive crowd of billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and corrupt local politicians completely stopped clapping. They all turned their heads to look directly at me. The bright, blinding stage spotlight suddenly swung over, illuminating my exact position perfectly in the dark. They fully expected a frightened, trembling, entirely submissive laborer to scurry out of the shadows with her head down. I took a slow, incredibly deep breath. The quiet calm before the massive storm was officially over. I reached up and pulled the battered, sweat-stained yellow baseball cap off my head, letting my hair fall loose around my shoulders. Then, standing in full, unapologetic view of the wealthiest men in the entire world, I grabbed the heavy plastic zipper of my stained, chemical-smelling janitor jacket. I pulled it down in one swift, highly aggressive motion. I violently shrugged off the cheap polyester disguise, letting it drop to the dusty wooden floorboards exactly like a discarded, worthless snakeskin. Underneath the bright, blinding stage lights, the pure, crisp white fabric of my official federal officer shirt practically glowed. The heavy, solid silver and gold badge pinned directly over my heart caught the artificial sun, flashing like a brilliant, terrifying warning beacon. The heavy tactical utility belt around my waist clinked softly but ominously as I stepped forward. I was no longer the invisible, pathetic dirt beneath his expensive shoes. I was the absolute, undeniable reckoning. I walked slowly and deliberately up the wooden stairs and stepped directly onto his grand stage, completely empty-handed, staring straight into the sudden, paralyzing, absolute shock that was violently exploding across Julian Vance's face. Julian Vance stared at me, the color draining completely from his perfectly tanned face. His eyes darted wildly, trying to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. He recognized the woman he had kicked, mocked, and forced to her knees just 24 hours ago, but now she was wearing the silver badge of the federal government. "You," he stammered, stepping backward, his polished facade violently cracking apart. "You are that filthy cleaner. Security, get out here. Get this insane imposter off my stage right now," he screamed, his voice breaking with sudden, uncontrolled panic. He frantically waved his arms toward the side of the stage, but the massive guard he expected to rush up the stairs was currently lying entirely unconscious in the dark shadows beneath the steel control room. None of his private mercenaries moved. The entire pavilion was absolutely paralyzed. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just offered him a slow, incredibly cold smile. I raised my right hand, revealing the small black wireless remote I had synced to the central projection system. "I am not an imposter. Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly, cutting sharply through the dead silence of the VIP pavilion. "I am the federal reckoning you tried to bury under your rotting foundation." I pressed the small red button. Instantly, the massive, high-definition screen behind him flickered and violently cut out. The beautiful fake three-dimensional rendering of the luxury resort vanished into total darkness. A second later, the screen roared back to life, but it was no longer a promotional video. It was a live, real-time structural ultrasound and deep seismic scan of the exact ground directly beneath our feet. The image was a terrifying web of stark black and neon colors. Massive, jagged red lines pulsed violently across the screen, spreading like a deadly virus through the visual representation of the foundational pillars. Huge pockets of deep crimson warnings flashed rapidly, screaming the undeniable truth. "Look closely at your timeless engineering marvel. Gentlemen," I announced loudly to the terrified crowd of international investors, "those massive red fractures are the primary load-bearing piles actively failing as we speak. The deep bedrock is entirely liquefied. You are currently standing on top of a massive, sinking liquid grave." Before anyone could even gasp, I pressed the button a second time. The massive concert-grade speakers crackled loudly. The undeniable, crystal-clear audio recording I had captured in the dark utility closet suddenly echoed across the entire construction site. Julian Vance's own arrogant voice blasted through the pavilion, completely unedited. "I am personally handing him an offshore account routing number with $1,500,000 currently sitting in it." The recorded voice of Julian echoed off the concrete walls. "By 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, he will officially stamp the concrete pouring permit, and those fake pillars will be permanently buried under 5,000 tons of wet cement." Then came the panicked, trembling voice of State Senator Robert. "If they bring their own deep seismic sonar equipment, they will see right through those fake structural supports you installed. We will both be spending the next 25 years rotting in a federal penitentiary." Absolute, chaotic pandemonium instantly erupted. The wealthy international investors dropped their expensive crystal champagne flutes. Glass shattered everywhere. The absolute illusion of safety evaporated. Billionaires in custom-tailored suits began shoving each other violently. screaming in pure terror as they frantically trampled over the expensive floral arrangements, desperately trying to escape the doomed pavilion before the ground swallowed them whole. The glorious masquerade had turned into a desperate stampede for survival. Julian did not run with them. He was completely trapped, sweating profusely under the stage lights. His empire was burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. Driven by sheer, desperate animal instinct, he frantically reached into his tailored vest pocket and pulled out his secure encrypted smartphone. His trembling thumbs flew across the screen, desperately trying to access his offshore banking applications to wire his hidden funds to a completely untraceable account so he could flee to his private jet. I stepped violently forward, swinging my right arm with everything I had. I slapped the phone brutally out of his hands. The expensive device flew across the wooden stage and smashed into dozens of pieces against a heavy steel microphone stand. Julian dropped to his knees, frantically trying to piece the shattered screen back together, his manicured hands scraping uselessly against the rough wood. "It is entirely gone, Julian," I said, standing directly over him, casting a long, dark shadow over his pathetic, trembling body. I transmitted the decrypted files to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Command Center late last night. Every single one of your domestic and offshore accounts was completely frozen exactly 5 minutes ago. Your jet is grounded. You are absolutely penniless. Right on cue, the deafening roar of heavy tactical vehicles violently overpowered the sound of the ocean wind. A massive fleet of black armored federal trucks smashed straight through the temporary front gates of Azure Crest. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear poured out, swarming the entire compound. The corporate security guards immediately dropped their weapons and raised their hands in total surrender. Heavy police sirens wailed from every single direction, a beautiful, piercing symphony of absolute justice. Julian Vance knelt on the stage, staring at his empty, shaking hands. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a hollow, completely broken terror. He was no longer a king. He was just a pathetic, terrified criminal waiting for his cage. I reached deep into the front pocket of my uniform pants. I pulled out the crumpled, dirty, violently torn $20 bill he had proudly thrown directly at my face yesterday morning. I knelt down, bringing my face intimately close to his. I grabbed the lapel of his incredibly expensive Italian vest and forcefully shoved the dirty, wet cash deep into his breast pocket. "Take this to buy your coffee in federal prison," I whispered directly into his ear, my voice dripping with absolute, freezing venom. "And by the way, the floor in the solitary confinement cell gets incredibly dirty. You better learn how to scrub it on your knees." I stood up, turned my back on the shattered billionaire, and walked slowly away. Federal agents rushed past me, violently grabbing Julian and pulling his arms behind his back to secure the heavy steel handcuffs. I walked down the stage stairs and headed directly toward my waiting official vehicle. Behind me, the massive, billion-dollar construction site was already being aggressively shut down, soon to be plastered with bright red condemnation tape waiting for the demolition crews to blast it into dust, returning the natural purity to the ocean skyline. The heavy gray clouds above finally broke, releasing a massive torrential downpour over the Malibu coast. The freezing, heavy rain soaked through my clothes, washing away the lingering smell of cheap ammonia and the toxic, rotting scum of corporate greed. I tilted my head back, letting the storm hit my face, and for the first time in days, I breathed in the absolute beautiful air of total victory. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it, as an ad-free channel. Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.